Welcome. You're listening to ElevateTALKS, a show designed to support the education and leadership goals of today's bankers. I'm your host, Michael Delucchi, and it's my pleasure to join you on your professional and personal journey to the top. Hello, everyone. Today's guest is Brian Battle, Director at Performance Trust in the Balance Sheet Strategy Group. Brian is joining us today to share with us three big things that banks have to consider, accept, and adopt to survive. It's getting harder for banks to survive and maintain their independence. And at the same time, many traditional statistics and strategies banks used in the past are invalid, inappropriate, or even obsolete. Though the use of such strategies could threaten the actual survival of many banks, few are doing anything about it. Not anymore. That's why Brian is here today. Brian is recognized nationwide as a market expert who provides valuable insight on issues related to liability management, mortgage securities, general market, and taxable municipal bonds. His 30 years of market experience in analyzing, underwriting, and trading has proven to be a tremendous asset for Performance Trust as well as our industry. As a frequent on-air commentator for CNBC, Fox Business News, National Public Radio, and even Bloomberg TV, Brian represents Performance Trust as one of its leading market experts. Brian holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Business and Economics from Winona State University and an MBA from DePaul University. Brian, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I'm glad to be here. It's a really important topic, and I'm glad we have some time.
Okay, Brian, tell us, what are the three big things that banks need to consider, accept, and adopt to survive?
Yeah, I think we'll go through we'll summarize them first and then go through them in detail. So number one, banks need long-term sustainable earnings and regulatory good standing. Second thing bank needs is to be able to compare unlike cash flows. And when I say unlike cash flow, I don't just mean bonds. I mean bonds are a cash flow, loans are a cash flow, liabilities are cash flows, and technically even capital is a cash flow. So you need to be able to compare unlike things. And third and finally, in evolution in analytical techniques and employing the finance of banking, there's air quotes around that, finance of banking skills will produce revolutionary results. So we're in this new era of banking. And so it's a very threatening market and it's getting harder and harder to compete, but it also creates fantastic opportunities.
So that's a pretty bold statement. What makes you say, though, the use of such strategies could threaten the survival of many banks?
Yeah, and so it's sort of a strong statement to say survival, but I think we're in an extinction era. If you look at 1992, there's probably 14,000 community banks and thrifts, and we're down in the 6,000, 5,800. We're probably heading toward 5,000. So you can say that this is already happening, and so everybody knows that number. But the facts are that something is going on here, and people are either getting merged, bought out, or are leaving the industry, and something is causing them to do that, or their behavior is preventing them from keeping them in the game.
So speaking of behavior, you're saying many traditional statistics and strategies banks used in the past are invalid and inappropriate and obsolete. Can you give us some examples of those?
Yeah, so the most, the industry is just, in our industry, certainly on the capital market side and the bond business, the market loves short-term answers. They love having a summary statistic like yield. So yield is, everybody uses yield as a measurement of reward, let's say. And so what I would like to say is yield is mathematically correct. So it's exactly right, but it might not be helpful because yield is not a measurement of reward. There are some assumptions baked into yield that either A, if you don't hold your asset to security, or if it prepays, or if there's optionality, yield is not what you get. So the industry is built around yield, and it's a faulty way to measure an asset over a long-term time horizon. In a very short-term time horizon, yield is okay. Mathematically, it's correct. But if people use yield as reward, they're getting an impartial answer. So that's the reward side of of maybe the shorthand the industry uses. Another shorthand that the industry would use is duration. Again, duration is mathematically correct. There's absolutely no question that duration, which if you calculate it using the formula, it's right, but it might not be helpful because, again, duration is not usable if the cash flow changes. Macaulay duration was invented in 1938, and the world has changed since then. So it's not necessarily an effective measurement of risk in this modern era. So if you look at that graph of 15,000 banks down to 5,000 banks, I would hazard to guess that a lot of those banks are using yield and duration, and they're probably getting wrong answers.
Okay, that makes sense. I can understand that. Well, all right, Brian, why don't we dive in, and why don't you tell us all about critical insight number one?
Absolutely right, sure. So let's talk about critical insight number one is long-term sustainable earnings and regulatory standing. You have to be able to deliver long-term sustainable earnings. So it isn't you got to survive quarter to quarter. You have to be able to serve your community and be vibrant to survive long term. So that's one thing to survive, but how you do it is also critically important. So you also need to be in regulatory good standing. As we all learned in 2008, regulatory risk is just as painful as interest rate risk or liquidity risk. And so if you don't have a way to figure out how we're going to have durable earnings, stay in good standing, you're at the risk of losing control of your own destiny. And when I say that, either you're going to have to sell, or you're going to sell if you don't want to, or you're just going to give up and leave because it's getting too hard.
Right. So what you're saying is the combination of being forward thinking, using statistics, the regulatory pressure, making sure that you're communicating with the regulators and staying out in front of that.
Yeah. And Mike, that's a great point, is communicating with the regulators. The one thing that we learned in 2008 is nobody likes to get surprised, and certainly your regulator doesn't. So if you're going to change what you do, or if you're going to modify, how you operate, giving your regulator some heads up on what's going on is vitally important. And so there's two things there is if one, you have to let them know what you're doing. And two, that has to be an ongoing relationship. The regulator is there as your has supervisor capacity. Their job is to defend the diff, right? That's what they're trying to do. They don't want to be surprised, and you have to let them know if you're doing things different, if you're changing, you're adding a business line, if you're adding online banking, taking pictures of your check for deposits, whatever you're doing differently, let them know, because first of all, it gives them some comfort. You have some idea in your plan, and secondly, like we said earlier, they're not surprised.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more there. As you know, we worked in a couple banks that had consent orders over the years, and that early and often communication was key in our success in turning those banks around.
Yeah, it has to be preemptive for sure. That's right, Mike.
Okay, what about critical insight number two?
So critical insight number two is you have to be able to compare unlike cash flows. So, if you work in a bank, you borrow short and you invest long, right? And if you're in a bank, you manage cash flows. That's your job, is cash flow management. You might say, "Oh, I'm a loan officer. I'm a credit person." Or if you're in management, you're like, "No, I'm running a business." No, what you do is you own, control, and create series of cash flows. And so, as I said earlier, that can be bonds. That's simple. Bond pays a coupon every 6 months and it matures. You make a business loan, it pays a principal every month and then it matures with a measurement of credit risk on top. Also, when you issue liabilities, you're issuing CDs for a 2-year or 3-year or 4-year. How do you do all those things? Because they're all the same behavior, but how do you do those in conjunction? How do you do those in concert? So when I say cash flow, I mean all the things that you do are cash flows, and you have to be able to compare them to each other and make decisions in concert.
Okay, so you're saying we need to compare cash flows, and when you compare something, they have to be similar. So how are cash flows the same?
Yeah, sure. So what makes cash flows the same is you have a bond or a loan is a contractual cash flows. You lend somebody money and they agree to give it back to you over a period of time with a certain amount of interest. And that's a business, it's a consumer, it's a mortgage, or it's the U.S. Treasury. So you have a contractual cash flow. So you have you know exactly what you're going to get. The other thing that you know for sure is going to happen is time is going to pass. So what you can do is say, man, if we own a 5-year treasury note today, a year from now, it's going to be a 4-year treasury note. Same thing with the loan. So time's going to pass. You're going to have a stream of cash flows. And so they're all the same in that way that they all behave the same. The credit's not the same. The decision making is not the same. I'm not saying that, but the thing that you buy and the thing that you control and the thing that you create all function exactly the same way. So they're similar in that we can compare them similarly, and you can just use simple math to do that. In a year from now, how much income am I going to have on this bond, on this loan? How much is it going to cost me to issue that CD in the next 12 months? Those are all just things that are measurable in dollars and cents, and we just have to go to the trouble to count up the cash flow and then compare them to each other.
That makes sense. And then how does that kind of translate into the investment committee or ALCO and trying to get them to have that culture of organized decision making around those cash flows?
So that's exactly right, Mike. So what you have to do is say, look, we're cash flow managers. That's our business. And so are we going to make an 8-year mortgage loan or buy an 8-year treasury note? Are we going to buy a 7-year mortgage or a 7-year treasury note? Once you can compare things the same way and take them and compare them to each other, this makes life simpler, especially when you get the investment committee. Because everybody, if you're listening to this call, you've probably been in the room where the loan guys want to make loans, the mortgage guys want to make mortgages, and the portfolio guys want to add bonds. And so there's a contest of assertion. No, mortgages are better. No, loans are better. No, we should buy bonds. So instead of having to assert or whoever has the tallest chair wins, and if you know your investment committee, you know who that probably is, or who the tiebreaker is, wouldn't it be great if you could take a level playing field and say, here's the cash flow of this bond, here's the cash flow of this loan. If rates go up or down, one of these is, how are these going to behave? And is one better than the other? And how much better or worse is one than the other? So what it does is it level sets everyone, so we're all talking about exactly the same thing. How much money are we going to get? And are we going to be happy or sad in the future if we made this decision rather than that decision? So taking bonds and loans and liabilities and breaking them down to their component pieces makes it simpler to compare them. And it also just gives everyone a common language. Then you can start making relative decisions instead of asserting truths.
Right. Well, you guys have been kind of talking about this and working on this for some time now. Do you find it easier or harder with the conversations you're having in today's current rate environment, or where the margins are, and with people trying to, looking at the short term rather than long term? Are those conversations always, are they the same, or are you seeing that different right now in today's environment?
Yeah, I think it's getting better. So 25 years ago was a long time ago. And so over time, the community banking community is getting more educated. Mm-hmm. They're more mathematical. They're more statistically savvy. They can use Excel. The community banking industry is getting smarter. And if you're on this call, you have survived 25 years. You're not one of those 14,000 people that got knocked out. So if you're trying to say, what are we going to do now? What's critically important is that the margin of error right now is so small. You have to be so much better. You got to be so much tighter on these decision making and these comparisons. And this is really what your job boils down to as running a community bank or being a PM is, should we do a 20-year bond or an 18-year bond? Or should we do a 9-year or a 7-year? Or should we do a combination of those? And so I'd say over time, I think we've found that the industry is more accepting, because the survivorship bias is the survivors are a little bit more intuitive that things are different. You can't do things the old way. Mm-hmm. And the margin of error is so small. You have to be so good, because if everything yields 7% and you make a mistake, you're still going to live because your deposits are 1 or 2. But if your deposits are a half and your yields are 2 and your loans are at 3, you have very little room to make a mistake, even if it's a small mistake. It could be threatening.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. All right. How about critical insight, our third insight? What are we looking at there?
Insight number 3. So here we go. And this is sort of the summary here is, a little music there too. So analytical and finance of banking evolution will produce revolutionary results. So really what that means is earnings drive value. The value of your institution is in your earnings. You could say there's a lot of different ways to measure what your institution is worth, but it's really earnings. That's what's really what you get paid for. And can you, and even if you're selling or not, that drives value, or if you're public or not, that drives value. And so do you have sustainable earning? And so the only way to do this, and this sort of leads into the second point we have, is can you make decisions in a cohesive and concerted way? And let me make make an example here. So if you were a community bank and all you make is floating rate mortgage loans, that would be great. And you'd make a bunch of money if rates rise, or if rates are unchanged, you make a bunch of money because you're making some sort of spread over some sort of benchmark. But where are you exposed? Where is your extinction event? And if you may, and this is a logical extreme, of course, where it gets very difficult for your bank is if rates go down. All the mortgages prepay, or all those mortgages hit their floors. So without being in concert saying, man, we're cash flow managers and our cash flow goes away if rates goes down. What should we do? Gee, you know what we should do? Maybe we should put on assets to do the opposite of what our floating rate mortgages do. And the art then becomes, and that might seem obvious, let's put on some fixed rate stuff so if rates go down, we can keep our margin. We'll preserve NIM and we'll live to fight another day. The art comes in and the math comes into how much fixed and floating should we have. If we have a bunch of 30-year fixed or a bunch of 5/1s or 7/1s, how much fixed rate do we need? And this isn't exotica. This isn't like, man, we got to put on an option rate Euro adjusted cap floor floating rate CMO. It's how many 10-year treasury notes should we own to offset that floating rate risk that we have in our loan portfolio. So that is where the coordinated decision comes in place, because if you're making this assertion that, holy cow, we've got to be long some fixed rate assets here because we're really exposed because all our loans are floating rate, you'll have a fight in the boardroom because nobody will understand what you're talking about. So this is an institution level education here. It's an institution level decision making process where the leaders of the bank and in investment committee or ALCO, wherever the board is, says, hey, are we making decisions with all the information that's available to us? And can we make coordinated decisions? And can we use these decisions to balance our risks? Because if rates go up, and intuitively everyone knows the bank's going to do better if rates go up. We're going to be worth more. We're going to make more spread. We're going to have more money. That's going to be great. But what is counterintuitive is if rates down, and everyone's sure, and you do a survey, everybody's sure, oh man, rates can't go down. Certainly a couple of months ago, everybody was sure rates couldn't go down, right? And so calling interest rates is dangerous. Certainly if your investment thesis is called on a rate call, one, you have to be able to call interest rates, which we believe is really difficult, if not impossible. And two, even new rates are going to be unchanged, or even if you knew rates are going to go up 100 basis points, then what decision should you make? It still begs the question of what do you do and how much of it do you do? And the only way to know those kind of answers is to take a holistic approach and say, what's our liability posture? What's our lending? What's our floating rate posture? What's our fixed rate posture? Where are we exposed? Where's our margin get compressed? Because as community bankers, we have a very long-term time horizon. It's not quarter to quarter. If you do EVE, or if you do NIM, if you do EVE, or if you do income simulation, the world doesn't end after 2 years. You're running an institution probably into perpetuity. So you've got a longer-term time horizon. You've got a responsibility to your employees and your community. You've got a long-term time horizon. You should be making longer-term decisions, because durability is what's going to separate the survivors from to be crass about it, the institutions that don't survive. Because rates can go up a lot, they can go down a little, they can last a long time. I have no idea where rates are going. We spend exactly 0% of our time trying to figure out where interest rates are going to go. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out, if rates go down, what's that going to feel like? If rates go up, what's that going to feel like? And everyone's answer is different. And if you don't know what your net interest margin is going to feel like in rates down 100 a year and 3 years from now, you have a big blind spot that you had better address. Because I'm not saying rates are going down, but if they do, you should know now what behavior you should undertake to make sure you survive if that happens.
When you're really talking about philosophy and culture and education in there, and it's got to be tough though, because while definitely community banks are a long-term play, investors' expectations and board of directors could be that quarter to quarter. And so it's really trying that. That's why I talked about, culture and philosophy has got to be bought in from all levels to get something like that accomplished then.
Absolutely, and this sounds really ephemeral at this level, because we don't have that much time. But the thing to do is get in a room and educate yourselves and say, so are we doing this the right way or are we not? And past success is wonderful. What you have to understand is if you're going to survive in the future, and every business is different. Fargo is different than Miami. So there is a difference in markets, and some people have fantastic deposit culture and fantastic deposit advantages. Some don't. It's a competitive market. It isn't. That doesn't matter. You have to understand your current posture, and you're certainly right. It starts with education. Hey, what do we not know? What do we not understand? B, hey, let's all agree that this is maybe something we have to look at. Then you can. The math comes last. It's the culture and it's the logic of, hey, are we doing this right? What are we missing? And do we want to be one of the guys that survives from 5,500 to 4,500 when that time comes? And it could be you might want to sell your institution, and you might want to say, hey, we're done. Great. How do you optimize the value if you're trying to find an exit? So this isn't to say you should stay in business or you shouldn't. The answer is, what are we doing to optimize our chances of survival, and what are we doing to optimize our profitability and the durability of our interest margin?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. This would be great. One of the things that I like to do on Elevate Talks is kind of talk about things that touch young leaders or upcoming leaders. So can you give any guidance to young financial leaders or controllers or other bankers that buy into this and want to get the buy-in within their bank to shift from the traditional statistics to strategies to these concepts? And have you worked with bankers that have been champions on this within their institution?
Absolutely, yeah. So we do a lot of education across the country, and we have a lot of young people in our groups. It's really great to see. And the challenge is, you go to learn about bond math and bond logic for 3 days, and then you go back to your institution and say, "Hey, man, I learned this great thing." And after 3 days of immersion, it's really hard to explain. Right. Or you've got a head full of like, "Wow, these are really gigantic ideas. How do I break this all down?" It's going to be really hard. So the first thing I'd say is make sure you're going to the PSB or you're going to your bank. Make sure you're educated and going to your local banking events. Then if you go to bond school or bond boot camp or whatever the name is, that you take the things that you learn, you bring them back to your institution, and you learn that it's culture and it's going to be uphill and you can't do it yourself. So what you have to do is in slow bites try and convince everyone that we're missing something. You don't have to proselytize yourself. You just have to raise the flag to say, hey, there's something here that we're going to have to know. And once you understand what's going on, and once you learn to be a cash flow manager, you can say, hey, that's really great. And you've learned something. But the better point would be to go learn about how to manage cash flow, learns how to measure and make relative value judgments, and then telling everyone back at headquarters, hey, there's something here. We all should learn about this so we can start making more fully informed decisions. Because the thing that we're not going to say is this decision's right and this decision's wrong. What we're going to say is you probably don't have enough information. Here is a full set of information. Now you make a more fully informed decision, because certainly the single statistics like duration or OAS or duration are snapshots, and they're definitely not enough information, and they will probably give you the wrong answer because they're just not comprehensive to make a complicated cash flow decision.
That's some really great insight there, Brian. I really appreciate that. I know that you guys do a lot of education, and I know you work with the banking schools, but I know you do some of your own programs around the country as well. Can you tell us a little bit about some of what you guys do on talking about some of these concepts and educating some of the bankers?
Sure. There's two programs fundamentally we do. The first is more of a C-suite level, which is Earn Your Independence, where we talk about these three big ideas where your board members, your CEO probably aren't going to be willing to torture themselves with bond math, but they certainly get the logic and the idea that, hey, we have to be able to compare things. So Earn Your Independence is aimed at more of a C-suite and a board level or more of an executive level of function where we talk about the logic and don't do so much of the math. We have a second program too called Performance Trust University, which is more of a nut and bolt portfolio manager class where we do some math, we do the logic. The story problems are the hardest things to do in math. The train leaves Philadelphia at 42 miles an hour and the train leaves Hoboken at 18. What time do they meet in Scranton? That's a math problem. Everybody can probably get the math right. It's the setting the story problem up. It's the logic that's hard. So we spend a couple of days really talking about the logic. And really, if you're a portfolio manager, you're managing cash flows, you're doing a lot of logic questions. You're trying to solve a lot of logic problems. So we do math and logic, and PTU is aimed more at the portfolio manager, the practitioner, than it is at the board level. So we have two different tracks that kind of get to the same points that are really should cover the whole institution and get everyone on firm footing to make more fully informed decisions in the future.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to sit through the Earn Your Independence program you guys did last year, and I could tell you as a former CFO of a bank, it was really insightful, really well done, and I really appreciate it. And we're excited about having you guys as part of both our Elevate Bankers programs this year. We're looking forward to seeing you in Las Vegas with our CFO track in a few months, and I'm really thankful that we were able to talk with you today.
We'll be glad to be there, Michael. Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it.
You have been listening to Elevate Talks, a weekly podcast created with the Elevate mission in mind, which is to educate, connect, and inspire bankers. For more information on Elevate, go to ElevateBankers.com, where you can find show notes from this episode and learn all about our 2020 conferences specifically designed for banking leaders. And don't forget, the Elevate Bankers Conference will be held April 14th through the 17th in Las Vegas, Nevada. Visit ElevateBankers.com and register today for this one-of-a-kind banking program designed for bankers in the areas of compliance, technology, finance, lending, marketing, and human resources. I'm your host, Michael Delucchi, and I hope you subscribe to our podcast. And until next week, I will see you at the top.